Hi, this is Danielle and Jonathan from Keplerling Preservation Services with our virtual coffee break. I thank you for joining us. Today, we had decided to talk a little bit about something that can really help you with your project when it's underway and you're dealing with the inspection process and the code officers. And I would say not every contractor is even aware that this tool is available. It was a while after it was enacted before we got well versed in it, and it was after one of us had attended a PA codes lecture, and they talked about all the ways that you had to bring things up to code with the new Uniform Commercial Code. And we were like, there has to be a solution for historic buildings. And then digging a little bit deeper, we learned more about it. Hopefully, if you are working with a design professional, they have a background in historic preservation, and then therefore they could help you navigate this too. But picking a contractor and or design professional that has the background in preservation really helps with those things, because sometimes it's one of those cases where you don't know what you don't know. So the existing building code really helps when a code official comes out and wants to require you to make changes to the historic building that would damage the historic fabric or the way the building functions. The building code is there to make sure buildings are safe. So the existing building code gives us a way to show that the building has been safe for however many years it's been in existence, and provide an option for people to kind of not argue, but that's not the. Yeah, sometimes you do have to argue your points, but you just have to pick your hill to die on. So, as I mentioned before, Pennsylvania in December 2006 adopted the Uniform Construction Code. Before that, every municipality, every township, every local government could enact their own building code. So there were different. There was BOCA, there was the universal. Some didn't have any. So everybody had it was like a hodgepodge. So everybody then went under the same construction code starting in 2007. The exception to the Uniform Construction Code are historic buildings listed on the state or national register, designated by a local or state law or survey, or part of a historic district. So most, if you're looking at Lancaster City, most of the city is under historic district. If a house is listed on the national register or it's been surveyed by local surveys. What that really doesn't protect are farmhouses that are outside of a historic district. And then you can apply then for that to be on the national register. So there are things that you can do, but that's their definition of a historic building. So, and if you want to change the usage of the building, it requires compliance with the modern building code, the UCC, without exemptions for the historic nature of the building. So that is one of the exceptions, and we'll get into some of those exceptions next. So the definition of a historic building is listed on the state or national register, like I said. If you want to get a building listed on the national register, it has to be associated with historic events, associated with a historic person, or how most get listed, have distinct characteristics of the architectural period, method or construction, or representative of the work of that period. It has to yield or may yield information to history, and it's usually at least 50 years old. And I say usually because sometimes there's exceptions made to that rule too. Like the Lorraine Motor Lodge, where Martin Luther King was assassinated, that was designated pretty quickly because of the historic events. So that's an example of a mid-century modern building that was designated before it was 50 years old. It was not that old when that happened. But usually 50 years is the cutoff. And when I would do presentations with my father, I would like to make him cringe by telling him now we can restore split levels and ranchers. So, you know, mid-century modern. He did not think much of that. I still do love my mid-century modern. So when you're having a project, and usually after you pull the building permit, there's a list of inspections on the permit that you have to call and have them come and inspect as the work continues. So the code official, which is the person who comes out to inspect, they are authorized and directed to enforce the UCC under the code. There are penalties, there's appeal process, the design professionals get involved if there's questions, but there's a whole structure. If you don't agree with the decision, there is a process to go through that you can appeal a decision, but the first person that you deal with is the code official that is authorized to interpret, and we don't always agree with their interpretations. Not that most code officials are pretty flexible and pretty understanding and will work with you, especially if they realize you're trying to do the right thing too. I've only encountered a couple in almost 20 years that are like, you need to do this, and they don't care that it doesn't really make sense. Alteration. So if you want to alter a historic building, so you're not changing the usage, but you want to alter it, you are allowed to make those changes. You have to comply with the requirements for the International Construction Code for any new construction, but the alterations are allowed to be made as long as they don't make the building less safe than it was prior to the alteration. That's the bottom line for that. There are exceptions. So the exceptions that we talked about, change of occupancy. So if you want to change, let's say, a barn into a house, or a house into a bed and breakfast, anything that would change the usage of the building, then you have to meet the modern code. And there are times that you can say, well, there's some things that they would require that doesn't make sense to do, and then that's when you have your conversations with the design professionals and the code person and kind of come up with some solutions. You can repair the original and repair it back to its original form, very much under the Secretary of Interior standard. Relocated structures must be put on a modern foundation. That's the rule for moving a building. Replacement in kind, again, under the Secretary of Interior standard. So if you have a piece of cornice that's missing, you can replace that with the same type of material and everything, and not have to have it meet the modern code. Interior finishes, so plasters, solid wood doors. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that usually is in question. I guess those are the two big things. So if you're dealing with fire rating, solid wood doors in a house have more, logically you can understand it has a more of a fire rating than a hollow core door, but it doesn't have the label. Now there are companies that give you that you can go. We've had doors that we've fabricated that we had to have labels made for a commercial building, and there are companies that will come and certify your doors. So that is, I mean, but you don't, typically in a house you don't need to do that. You just need to know that your interior finishes meet the fire codes, and you don't need to worry about that, provided they're original features to the house. Grand staircases. So most staircases in older buildings are not code, like not up to modern code. Usually the rails are too low, so you could tip over them. What is the modern 42?
I think
high.
That's what it is.
Yeah. The treads are usually not deep enough
Or tall enough.
And then the risers are usually either too tall or not tall enough, depending on how much room they had to lay out the stairs. and the winder stairs that you see are not code. So usually those go up into attics, or in Philadelphia the Trinity houses, where there's three 3 rooms stacked on top of each other, and that's really all the house is, those winder stairs are not code. Those are allowed to stay under the existing building code because they have been in the house for all this time. Now, you couldn't build a new house with those same, you would have to meet the modern code. And if you change the stairs, that kind of gets into a gray area. So they can't come in and say, you have to change the staircase even though you weren't going to do anything to it. But if you start to modify the stairs, then you probably would be required to bring it up to a modern code.
And that's all based on the code official determining if it can be done or not at that point.
Right.
There's some spaces like the Trinity houses, kind of impossible to put a code one in.
Yeah, because they're just stacked and they're just winders the whole way up. The substantial improvement, if it's more than 50% of the building's value that you're putting into the project, then you do have to meet the modern code. Structural, seismic retrofits, and then if there's a dangerous condition, you have to eliminate any dangerous condition. What's nice with structural usually is it's not seen. So you can make structural repairs and people won't see them. It won't detract from the historic building, and then you can also then add some modern materials in that the code official might be a little bit more familiar with. Fire requirements, making sure your mechanical rooms are sealed off from the rest of the house so that if a fire would break out. And there's materials that you can do that doesn't damage the historic fabric that can do that. That's typically with more of a substantial improvement. If you're just doing a project in your house, you wouldn't be required to do that. It is, from a safety standpoint, it makes sense, but you wouldn't be required to do that. Means of egress. So in historic buildings, the doors usually open. If you're walking in, they open in. But on a modern building, the doors open out to make egress easier. Typically, on a historic building, you get to keep the way your door swings. The one thing that we always make sure we do if we're putting new doors in or changing something with the door is that we do put safety glass, and we put tempered glass in, because that is something that you can order it without the logo on, so nobody knows that you've changed it. It's just not wavy, but it allows you to meet the modern safety requirements without endangering people and having people go through the glass. Electrical code, you can replace in kind, but you need to make sure everything's grounded, and that you replace any knob and tube, and make sure you don't tell your insurance company you had it in the house.
And knob and tube you cannot replace in kind. That's not even feasible.
Right. So yeah, so that's, and then energy conservation, you're not required to meet the modern code in a historic building. The one thing I would say about energy conservation is that typically buildings built before the 1950s are much more energy efficient than buildings that were built between like 1950 and 1970-ish. So typically you're doing better than the modern code anyway, but this doesn't, you don't have to run all the tests and everything to prove that it's more energy efficient. And the other big thing that comes up is floodplains. So a lot of historic houses were built in floodplains near water, and there are some provisions in the building code that say you cannot do certain things in floodplains, but you're exempted from that in a historic home. Did you have anything else you're thinking?
No, sounds pretty good.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us for our preservation coffee break. We'll see you next week at 4:30. Thank you. Wednesday at 4:30. Thank you. Not just any day next week.